looking at an empty room out there.
I studied all weekend for all the quizzes, so I'm ready to take them.
Okay. They're not set up so you can see them?
No.
Okay, I'll get them up.
Okay, thank you.
They should be. Had you taken some of them before? Is that the deal?
Yes.
Okay. Still here. I don't see anybody out there in Never Never Land. Anybody out there in Plainview?
Just me.
Just you. You scared them all away.
I guess so.
It's colder in there. They were warming up a little bit. Greetings. Where's that chick? Oh, it's okay. Got it. So we left off last time. I think we were talking about some of the utopian communities, utopian or whatever you want to call them. Do you understand what a utopian community is? What utopia is supposed to be? It's supposed to be the perfect community. And different people have different ideas about what it is. The Shakers tried to organize something like that. They didn't last that long. I think we left off last time talking about furniture and things like that. I'm always interested in these groups when they go off and set up their own little community or their commune. How do they feed themselves? I know in other places the communes they stay really busy. I guess when I was stationed in Israel, those people form small communities they call kibbutzes, and everybody's got a job in there, and they support themselves from whatever it is that they're doing. That's the only income they have. Some of these groups that we're talking about here, well, we talked about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They've grown and grown and grown. They're incredibly successful. Some of them were here for a moment and then disappeared. The Shakers, pretty much so. The next community on my little list is the Oneida community. Let me see if I can get the slide to come up on there. The Oneida community, founded by a guy named, you can't see it. Come on, Gene. There it is, in all of its blurry splendor. Founded by a guy named John Humphrey Noyes up in Vermont, but he's going to move to Oneida, New York. And his believing was a little strange too, kind of semi-Christian. He believed in true conversion. Once you really belonged to the faith, you were no longer subject to sin. I've always wanted to find one of these people still alive and ask them exactly what that means. You mean if I become perfect, that anything I do is not a sin? Does that mean if I become perfect, I can't do a sin? I'm thinking, well, I don't have to worry about that because I'm never going to get to that point, but just curious. They believed in free love. They believed in universal marriage. Once again, I'm interested in how they fed themselves. In their case, they made traps during the era when fur was still big business. They also did silk culture, canned fruit, and eventually they're going to start manufacturing silverware, and they're going to get really good at it, tableware. And when all the things they believe in start to fade away, one of the first things to fade is their belief that all children were children of the whole group, so they all kept the children separate. There weren't parents that had their children with them, and my guess is that sooner or later people are not going to like that, and they're not going to go along with it. But they did keep on making the silverware, and they're going to incorporate, it will become the Oneida Community Limited. And if you go to Walmart right now, over to the silverware section, you can still find Oneida silver. It's not, first of all, it's not silver, stainless steel, and it's not made by them anymore. They sold their name about, I don't know, 17 or 18 years ago. It's probably all made in China now. That's the Oneida community. Then you had this place that only lasted 2 years. It was founded by a guy named Robert Owen. He thought that if people are making big money from industry, coal mining, things like that, they should share that money with the people that are working for them, give them benefits, take care of their health issues, set up schools for their children and things like that. He ran into a lot of opposition over in England where he lived, so he found some land over in Indiana and moved 900 people over to colonize in Indiana. They called it New Harmony, was the name of the colony, but it approached being, you know, pretty pure socialism, something of that nature. And of course, where are you going to get the money to do all these things? They went bust after about 2 years. Then there's the famous Brook Farm in Massachusetts. It was founded by a transcendentalist, and we'll talk about them in a minute, creating kind of an early day think tank where brilliant people, intellectual people could get together and talk about whatever and put their ideas together. Of course, they have to feed themselves too. So the idea was, we'll form a community. Everybody will have a job in the community, but we'll spend as much time as we can using our minds, expanding our minds. The one thing it had a motto called high thinking, plain living. The one thing they did have was a great school for their kids. Because, I mean, can you imagine if you went to a school and all the people that were teaching you were famous authors and famous intellectuals and the world's most famous scientists? You couldn't help but learn a little bit from that. It became pretty well known in Massachusetts, and people that didn't belong to the community wanted to send their kids there too. Brook Farm is, as a utopian community, is going to kind of fall apart when people start dabbling in the kind of politics that scare some people. Very advanced socialism, and going all the way down the gamut to anarchism, which are people that don't believe that you need a government or any kind of formal structure to live by. That usually scares most people away right there. Now, here's Mr. Hunt teaching literature. It's not just literature, it's a school of thought. It's called Romanticism. For the last 200-300 years in Europe and America, people of learning have followed the paths of science and rationalism. People like Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." Everything can be rationally explained. You can prove things. It's like the world's based on geometry and things like that. There's a proof for everything. And the revolt against this is, you can't prove everything. Some things you just know. And a fellow by the name of Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, is going to write something called A Critique of Pure Reason. He'll write that in the late 1700s, but it's going to filter its way through to America in the 1800s. And the idea of a romanticism, just remember this much, don't write all that stuff on that slide down. Elevates intuitive knowledge, things you know from intuition, at the expense of rational knowledge, things that you can prove. Of course, when it gets to America, being what we are, we're going to tweak it a little bit, this romanticism. We're going to add it to things we already have in our minds, like of the New England Puritanism. Can you imagine taking romanticism and combining it with Puritanism? That's already getting a little twisted, and some of these philosophers had a lot of money, so they were studying things far beyond most of us. They were studying East Asian thought. So you get kind of a combination of Immanuel Kant's thinking with New England Puritanism and mysticism. They're studying things like Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, and that sort of thing, putting all those things that they learn, or they think they've learned from those different philosophies together, and they come up with what they call transcendentalism. All you need to remember about transcendentalism, I'm going to introduce you to some people involved in it, but transcendentalism of itself is just emphasis on things that go beyond the limits of reason. Can anybody in here name something that you can't prove? You can't rationally prove?
Religion.
Elements of religion. Things like love, emotional things, happiness. How can you prove happiness? Right? You know, it's like the guy talking about pornography. I don't know, I can't define it, but I know when I see it. You know? I know happiness when I'm happy. So what does happy mean? You can't prove it. You can't even define it, really. Maybe you could. Maybe you can figure some chemical thing where endorphins in your brain. Yeah, who knows? Who knows and who cares? Some of the leading transcendentalists happen to be preachers, Unitarians, which is kind of an all-inclusive sort of Christian church. George Ripley, one of them, he's one of the organizers of Brook Farm, wrote an encyclopedia. James Freeman Clark, he's a Unitarian minister. He was also the head of the Harvard School of Divinity. I'll point out, I'll show you in a minute, but a lot of our universities way back then were all founded by churches. Theodore Parker, he has a lot of his philosophy has influence on some pretty important people to us, such as Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King. Now, the people that are famous for transcendentalism, one of them is a lady named Margaret Fuller. I would like you to remember her name. She only lived for 40 years. If she'd lived longer, maybe she would have done more. She fought for women's rights and children's rights. She was a journalist. That was extremely unusual in her time. She was a published literary critic, a book reviewer. And there just weren't any women doing that. She wrote a book herself called Women in the 19th Century, considered to be the first major U.S. feminist work. Just don't know what would have become of her if she'd lived a little bit longer. She only lived for 40 years. Two most famous transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, American transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They called old Ralph Waldo Emerson the high priest of transcendentalism, whatever that means. He was interested in public education. He was interested in the principles of self-reliance. He was interested in the concept of nonconformism. How can you define a nonconformist? He's a person who doesn't conform. But if you can really define nonconformist, then he's probably not a nonconformist because it shouldn't have any rules. Maybe an anarchist. Henry David Thoreau is important. I want you to remember about him a couple of things. First of all, he was also interested in nonconformism. Second of all, he was interested in a political sort of principle called civil disobedience. In other words, breaking the law without violence or anything, but breaking the law for purpose. As far as conformists are concerned, he is the man that originated the... You've heard of that guy marches to a different drummer? He's the guy that came from. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. A lot of times when we think a guy's a little bit weird or a little different, we'll say he's marching to a different tune or to a different drummer. He wrote a book called Walden. I've got a copy of it. It's a pretty big book. He had placed high value in natural things. He thought that American Indians were some kind of almost supernatural thing. As far as civil disobedience was concerned, basically he said if a law is such that it requires you to be an agent of injustice, break it. Don't be an agent of injustice to anyone. If a law is an unfair law, break that law. He had a tremendous influence on people like Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., certainly practiced civil disobedience. Even more important than those two people, he had an influence on people like Mohandas Gandhi. Anybody know who he is or was? When India was fighting for its independence in the 1940s, this guy led a program of civil disobedience, and he did hunger strikes and things like that, and helped get India its freedom from Britain. And he was influenced, he said he was influenced by Henry David Thoreau. What's important about that, or what's interesting about that is, here we are, America, a new country, we're absorbing stuff from all over Europe and all around the world. We're absorbing all the stuff that comes to us from immigrants, from studies, things like that. Now all of a sudden you see people outside of our country beginning to pay attention to what we're thinking. I mean, in the next 60 years, they'll be paying attention to us concerning economics, concerning science, concerning industry, but the thinking part is starting with people like Henry Thoreau. That's a major thing. Some of our literary transcendentalists, Nathaniel Hawthorne, last hour I was trying to remember something he'd written. I think he wrote The Scarlet Letter. I think he wrote The House of Seven Gables. Herman Melville, anybody know what he wrote? He wrote about internal conflicts in people. The most famous book was about the great white whale and Captain Ahab, who was always trying to kill. He was obsessed with killing the great white whale. The book was called Moby Dick. Emily Dickinson was a poet. She corresponded with a lot of these people from her room because she lived almost all of her life in her own room, in her family's house. She'd gone to college. I don't know how true the story is. The story is she fell in love with one of her teachers or something like that, and it was something that was totally forbidden. And she just went home and locked herself in, and that was that. Tremendous amount of writing. I think I've got one little. A narrow fellow in the grass. What is she describing when she's talking about a narrow fellow in the grass? By the way, she doesn't use a lot of punctuation or capitalization. A narrow fellow. She's talking about a snake. She's writing a poem about a snake. But she corresponded with all the big transcendentalist names. Walt Whitman, he was a real nonconformist individualist. He wrote a famous collection of poetry called Leaves of Grass. Pretty much about his philosophy of life and humanity. It got a little bit too sensual for early publishers, and some people didn't like it. But he praised nature, the individual human's role in nature, the mind and spirit, the mind or the spirit. He was very, very much interested in things like abolition of slavery, women's rights, and that sort of thing. He wasn't tremendously popular in his own lifetime. It was funny because he didn't like organizations. He was in favor of abolition of slavery, but he didn't like the pro-abolition movements, organizations. He was in favor of women's rights, but he didn't like the women's rights organizations. He worked, I think, as a nurse in the Civil War. Another big development was the development of larger rotary printing presses. The Napier press is one of the earliest ones. It could turn out in between 5,000 and 10,000 sheets in an hour. Kind of like a giant mimeograph machine. You guys don't even know what a mimeograph machine is. That's how you used to get your tests printed. They put a mat around the cylinder and just fed paper into it and rotated that paper, and it would print your test for you. We used to have to do that for our exams. Later on, they're going to build a really big press called the whole rotary press. What this meant was we could turn out thousands and thousands of sheets of newspaper and that sort of thing. The presses themselves cost a lot of money, but the production, once you had that press, was really dirt cheap. So you could put out a newspaper for a nickel a copy or less, and make all your money on advertising. Believe it or not, depending on how you counted it, we had one of the world's, probably the world's highest literacy rate for many years. We've slid behind now. Other people have passed us. And it's strange because we had no public school system until the 1830s. And a fellow that you have some reading for, I put up Unit 9. I don't think I turned it on yet. Anybody looking at their... I'll turn it on. One of the fellows in there is Horace Mann. He's up in Massachusetts. He supported the idea of the state having a school system. And he thought it would promote social stability and equal opportunity. He also supported the notion of normal schools. Anybody know what a normal school is? I don't think they call any schools normal schools anymore, but a normal school is nothing more than a teacher's college. The idea was our teachers aren't well enough trained. We need to get them better education so they can pass their better education on. By 1836, somewhere around then, Massachusetts will have the first state-run school system, and he'll be running it. Look at this list of colleges. I should have fixed Harvard too, but do you notice anything funny about this list? These are all colleges we had before 1800. Notice the parenthetical comments I have after each one. Almost all of our colleges were run or at least started by different churches. The Anglican Church, Conservative Puritan Church, Anglican, Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed Church, Baptist Church. And most of our colleges actually, that was one of the main things they taught, was religion. Somewhere after the Civil War, somewhere as we approach 1900, these big schools like Harvard are going to start teaching sciences, have laboratory science, engineering, things of that nature. But up until this point, they're all very, very literary and pretty strongly religious, with some exceptions. By 1840, we have 78 colleges in our country. 35 of them were founded between 1830 and 1840. But even before that, the U.S. Military Academy, 1802, U.S. Naval Academy, 1845, University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's baby, in 1817, Amherst, Oberlin, Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke was a women's institution for quite a while, in 1837. Some of these early transcendentalists were amongst the women who went to college, the first women to graduate from college. Some of the other reformers, one of the big reform things, and there's also some readings about, I don't think there's anything about temperance. Temperance, what's that all about? The control of the use of alcoholic beverages. 1810, we got a population of about 7.2 million. We have 14,000 distilleries producing 25 gallons per annum. Think about the population being also a lot of women and children in that population. We're turning out a lot of booze. And it's causing social issues, some really bad social issues. Kind of connected in some respect to industrialization. We'll have our first society to control how alcohol is used in 1826, the American Society for Promotion of Temperance. This doesn't mean banning alcohol, it just means controlling it. People walked around, they had this little patch that they wore on their jacket or their shirt with a T in it, on it, big T on it. In 1836, Massachusetts will pass the first law controlling liquor. By 1855, so we're almost at the Civil War, we still only have 13 out of 31 states with liquor laws of any sort at all. Care for the insane, another thing. So let's say it's 1800, and in my family, I've got one child who's totally wacko. What do I do with that child? Can't take him out to the well and drown him. What do you do with him? You don't want to advertise him around the neighborhood either, do you? You lock him up in the back room. If the child's totally beyond all control, you might even chain him up. You might even tie him down. By the way, some people still do that. If you didn't have a lot of money, what did you do? Where did they go? What if they were indigent and had no money at all? Where are you going to put these people? A lot of times they put them in jail. Locked up, totally innocent people who are just wacko, locked up with murderers and thieves and whatever. A lady named Dorothea Lynn Dix had gone over to Europe to look at this. She became interested in it. I think that had something to do with someone in her family. And she studied a little bit in England and came back to America and said, we've got to do something about this. And she did a survey around the eastern part of the United States, looking at what was done with insane people. And she wrote this presentation that she delivered before the legislature of Massachusetts and some other northeastern states, and also eventually before the United States Congress. describing the situation of insane people in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, lashed into obedience. And she started a movement to build asylums. And in a number of states, they started passing laws reflecting this. She made herself so well known from her campaign. She pushed other ideas that government should have a direct, active role in social welfare in general. The government should be active on behalf of the indigent and insane. She did lobbying just everywhere she could go. State legislatures and the Congress. And we get the first generation of American mental asylums. And she was so well known that when the Civil War began, they asked her to become the superintendent of nurses for the Union Army. I think she worked hard and was a good organizer and all that, but she was kind of toughened up by all the hardships she'd gone through, and I don't think most of the nurses liked her very much because she was really, really strict. Then finally, she's going to make enough enemies, they're going to fire her from the job, but she'll go right on campaigning for care of people, improving prisons, and that sort of thing for the rest of her life. How about women's rights? Somebody tell me, I'll put this slide back up in a minute. Somebody tell me, what were women worried about in 1840? Did they want the vote? What were they crying about? What were they campaigning for? What do you think the most important thing was for a woman in 1840? It would fall under the general rubric of equality. Well, what do you think they were fighting about? One of the readings I give you is talking about equality before the law, talking about the issue of women wanting to petition. Remember, the First Amendment says we all have the right to petition. Women wanting to petition the government. And a lot of people say, that's not a woman's place. A woman shouldn't do that. That's disgraceful. John Quincy Adams argued in favor of it. But what was the big issue that women had? I'll tell you what the issue was. Here's the issue. It's called coverture. Basically, without reading all the words down there, other than the words at the top of the page, when a woman got married, under the law, everything she owned now became the property of her husband. A woman wasn't allowed to conclude her own contracts. She wasn't allowed to sell her property or buy her own private property. Strange, because if she was divorced or a widow or just never got married, she had all those rights. But if she got married according to law, which had existed for hundreds of years in England, and also because we copied most of their law, she lost all those rights. And a couple of women who had pretty good lives on their own, came from upper middle class families, they decided to make a real issue of it. They're going to organize kind of a convention at in Seneca Falls, New York. It was in one of the ladies' property, I think. It was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And they organized a gathering to discuss women's property rights. You know, they didn't like this coverture nonsense. There was another woman who sympathized with them on that, Catherine Beecher. She came from a big family. Most of that family spent its time fighting for the abolition of slavery. Catherine Beecher disagreed with these ladies about a lot of things. For example, she thought women still had the primary job of raising children and taking care of households, but she agreed that women should have rights of property. And there were men that joined in with this argument too. Gerrit Smith, one of the founders of the Liberty Party. It's an anti-slavery party. Frederick Douglass, African American, former slave, argued that if I'm a free man and I have the right to vote, why should I be allowed to vote if women can't vote? Horace Greeley, famous newspaper publisher, one-time presidential candidate, same argument. A few years after the Seneca Falls conference, that's where they had the first conference, a lady named Isabella Baumfree, a New Yorker. She was a freed slave. She will come to one of these women's rights meetings, which was basically populated with women. And there's a kind of issue that's raised right away. This is a black woman. She doesn't belong here. And she made a famous speech. She was pushed by a lot of the women, New England women there. You've got to do this. And they made her make a speech, which became a really, really famous speech and became the source of a slogan, "Ain't I a woman too?" Then it was gentrified into, "Am I not a woman too?" And she became one of the leaders of the fight for abolition of slavery. There are other women like Harriet Tubman and others, but I associate them more with the escape, the physical escape from slavery in the South, and not so much with women's rights. So much for that set of slides. I'm going to jump to another set. Remember that word coverture. I'm sure that will pop up on the final exam. Look at this second set of slides. It also has some of the early reform things on it. Let's zero in on this right here. The elephant, the major elephant in the room, often not mentioned because it was a source of conflict, was slavery. This is a famous, famous photograph. This is a slave from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, scarred by being beaten by his overseer. By the way, the particular guy that put those scars on him got fired, but I'm not sure if it was a matter of humanitarianism or a matter of him damaging property. People ask me, a lot of students ask me, if there were that many slaves in the South, if there were more slaves in South Carolina, for example, than there were white people, why didn't they just rise up and kill all the white people? Why didn't they resist? Why were they just sitting around waiting for someone else to save them? And of course, the truth of the story is very complex. One is, they did resist. How did they resist? One way was using their feet, getting the heck out of there. You didn't have to go too far south early on to be in Spanish or Mexican territory. You wouldn't be a slave down there. In the 1700s, there were uprisings like the Stono Rebellion, where they actually tried to go south. There were some very violent uprisings in New York State. But when these slaves first came to America, what were some of the problems they had about rebelling or getting together? One was they didn't share a common language. They came from many different countries in Africa. I spent 2.5 years in one small African country in which they spoke 35 different languages. In fact, the flavor of the year was whatever language the president spoke. That was their official language. The country I was in was Zambia, and there were two major languages, many languages. Two major was Nyanja and Bimba. And when the president was a Nyanja speaker, then everyone spoke Nyanja. And when he was a Bemba speaker, then everyone spoke Bemba. A lot of similar words, but the point I'm making is they couldn't communicate. Not only that, they didn't share the same religions. A lot of them, if they were from different tribes, were mortal enemies of one another just because of what group of people they were from. So it's going to take them a while to form more of an identity where they share a language. Eventually, many of them became Christianized. And you're going to see more intercommunication. Beginning in the 1800s, there will be slave uprisings, or discussions of them. One of the earliest was conducted by a guy named Gabriel Prosser. His name was Gabriel. His owner's name was Prosser. Here was a man who was a tall, good-looking man, intelligent. He'd been taught to be a blacksmith, and he got really good at it. And his owner didn't really have that much work for him, so he rented him out, sent him to different farms to do blacksmith work. Of course, they would pay him, the owner. But they also usually, because he did a good job, they'd give Gabriel money on the side too. So after a while, he's got some money, and he's going there on his own. No one's escorting him to these places. He walks there. So he passes through Richmond, Virginia. He can even stop and buy himself a beer. And he meets free black people, a lot of ship's crewmen and people like that. He hears about things he's never known about, never been taught about, like the Haitian slave rebellion and things of that nature. And he starts talking to his friends. All they have to do is make a small mistake and they can get in big trouble. And some of his friends start talking about, why don't we just go to the governor of the state and petition him, make life easier on us, change things, make rules. Someone heard about this discussion, these plans they were making. Probably because one of the people that was involved in the discussions got cold feet and was afraid of retribution, so he ran and told his owner. And they rounded up all these people, and they were put on trial, and over 20 of them were executed. They're also very proper about it. If you execute a slave, what do you have to do? You have to compensate his owner because he was property. In fact, James Monroe was the governor of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson was getting ready to run for president, and there are letters between the two men saying, wait a minute, what did we say in the Declaration of Independence? What are we doing? What are we doing to fellow human beings? They were really, really highly conflicted, but they didn't come out and do anything about it because it would have been dangerous to do so. Politically dangerous, physically dangerous. 1811 saw probably the largest of all the slave uprisings. It was called the German Coast Rebellion, or the New Orleans Rebellion, and it was fairly spontaneous, and a bunch of slaves were working in the fields one hot afternoon, just decided, I'm not going to do this anymore. And they all started walking down the road in the direction of New Orleans. They knew there were a lot of free people of color in New Orleans. And this group grew and grew and grew, and a couple of white people that tried to stop it came to bad ends. And the local people down in that area, the German coast area, were scared out of their minds. And they'd call up their militia, and they go after these people. They captured some of them, executed them, chopped heads off, put heads up on pikes as a warning to other slaves. And then it degenerated into just, if you saw a black person out in the woods, and he wasn't working in a field or something, you went after him and they started killing all sorts of people. Pretty nasty. In 1822, a free African American by the name of Denmark Vesey. He's got a lot of friends that are slaves, even relatives. He gets an idea. All we have to do is sail down to Spanish territory, down to Spanish America. They don't have slavery there. There's a lot of escaped slaves down there. We just need to steal some ships. He knew something about that. They decided they were going to start a big fire in Charleston. And while everybody was busy putting the fire out, they were going to grab a couple ships and take off. They didn't get away. They got caught. Bad things happened to all of them. They're all executed one way or another. But it scared people. Now, ever since Gabriel Prosser, maybe even before, every time one of these incidents happens, instead of moving towards emancipation of slaves, they make more and more and more laws controlling slaves. Gabriel Prosser got into trouble because he was relatively free moving across the town. And as a result of that, they made laws in Virginia making it illegal to let your slave go anywhere by himself. They also made laws, a lot of the plantation owners went hunting. The slaves would go with them, carry their guns for them, and things like that. They made it illegal to allow a slave to carry a firearm. They made it illegal to allow or to teach a slave how to read and write in almost all the southern states. A lot of slaves had their own little religious gatherings, and they started making that impossible or illegal. 1831, you have a young man named Nat Turner. I really don't know all about Nat Turner. I mean, there's a lot of theories about him, but he was a young man, and he seemed to be a guy that could tell the future. And he had these visions. He may have actually had a medical condition, but he kept talking about the millennium when we'll all be free, and he got attention from a lot of people. And I think he went over the edge in 1831, maybe because of a physical thing that happened. There was a solar eclipse, and he thought that was his sign to rise up. And so he did rise up, and he instantly had quite a few followers. And they grabbed their tools or whatever weapons they could get and started grouping up. They killed some white people, about 50 altogether, before white militias are going to capture them all and execute them all, including Nat Turner. Nat Turner was in jail for a while before he was executed. And a number of people were able to go in and interview him and ask him for what he was thinking about and all of that. And you can actually find some of what he said from that. But they killed him, and then they tore his body up. They buried him in a hidden grave so that nobody could go and worship at his grave or anything like that. Each time one of these things happens, also in the case of Nat Turner's rebellion, they're going to start blaming people who are writing anti-slavery literature and putting it in the mail. We'll read about a couple of those in a minute. But this is early on, what the slaves did on their own. These are people, our forefathers we call them: Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, John Jay. They all spoke out against slavery. Probably Benjamin Franklin did a whole lot in written words. Thomas Jefferson, over and over again, did things to show he hated slavery. And maybe next time, if I have time, I'll tell you about the split in his mind between not liking slavery but still owning slavery. It had to do with real estate law. Go figure. Because in Virginia, slaves were considered to be real estate. And in Virginia, I'm trying to remember, entailment is what it was called, E-N-T-A-I-L. You couldn't sell your property out of your family. That was to keep together these giant plantations they had, So no matter how hard you got up, you couldn't pass your property out of the family because it only belonged to you as a safekeeper of that property until you died. Then whoever came after you owned it. And since slaves were considered to be real estate in Virginia, entailment prevented some people from being able to free their slaves because that was taking their property out of the family. Go figure. James Madison, James Monroe, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Marshall all believed in something called the American Colonization Society, and they were going to buy land in Africa and help move slaves that were freed back to Africa. The name of the country that finally came out of that was Liberia. It's still there. It's a very conflicted country. Why? Because Africans don't all come from the same place. And some of them didn't fit in Liberia. So there was a lot of strife between the people that lived there already and the slaves that are being returned there. That was the American project of doing that. And believe it or not, the pro-slave and anti-slave people, some of them from all sides, supported this colonization society. The slavery people wanted to send all free people of African origin back there so they wouldn't get the slaves excited. The humanitarians wanted to do it to give these people a safe place to live. Go figure. Here's one family, and I mentioned them already. There's Catherine Beecher on the far right. They were all, the males in the family were all preachers. Lyman Beecher was the head of the family. His son Henry Ward Beecher was also an pro-abolition preacher. One thing about the church and slavery, after 1800, you noticed, several states had votes about slavery. Virginia, by about 3 votes, failed to end slavery. It was that close. And what you saw were the preachers started coming up with stuff that they could find in the Bible that seemed to justify slavery. So the church isn't fighting in the South, isn't fighting against slavery. These guys aren't from the South by any means. Do you recognize any of the people there? One we'll talk about again. That's Henry Ward Beecher. But how about Harriet Beecher? Her name's Harriet Beecher Stowe. Anybody recognize that name? Okay. I won't tell you who she is until we get a little bit further down the line. The Grimke sisters. Why they have the pictures of them when they're old, I don't know. They're plantation-born white girls who played with slave children when they were small and couldn't understand why these children became slaves when they grew up. They also believed in women's rights. And as they got a little bit older, realized they just didn't fit in South Carolina plantation society, so they left. They both went up to Pennsylvania. They were among the first American women to act publicly in different social reform movements. Women's rights, abolition of slavery. They lecture, they tour around talking about their personal experiences with slavery on a plantation because they've been brought up on a plantation. Theodore Dwight Wells spoke out against slavery. He was an organizer. He wrote a book called American Slavery as It Is. On your notes that I've given you, there's literally 100 different people, interesting people involved in this. Some African American origin, some white people. Here's the most famous name in the abolition of slavery. In the mid-1800s, just before the Civil War, from 1830 onward, I guess. His name was William Lloyd Garrison. And sometime around 1830, remember that's when Nat Turner had his uprising. He starts publishing a paper called The Liberator, sticking it in the mail, sending it all over the country. He also founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and a few years later gets together with Arthur and Louis Tappan to form the American Anti-Slavery Society. He's got a particular bee in his bonnet that some other people don't. And the bee in his bonnet is slavery is supported by the Constitution of the United States. That makes the Constitution of the United States an evil document. And he began encouraging people, don't follow the federal law, don't vote, don't participate because this Constitution is evil. Some people who were in the anti-slavery movement did not like that. And they're going to oppose that. They're going to split away from him, including the Tappan brothers. They're going to split away from him. But he'll still be a really, really big name in abolition of slavery for many years. He will become an associate of Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave. Frederick Douglass was one of the most eloquent writers against slavery. Once he escaped, his owner broke the law and taught him to read and write, and he was very well read. He's written a lot of very interesting things. I probably have to put a couple up for you in the next unit's reading. He and William Lloyd Garrison cooperated with the Liberator briefly, but when William Lloyd Garrison started coming out against the Constitution, Frederick Douglass disagreed, and so he's going to go found his own newspaper. There's some African Americans, big-time abolitionists. Brown and Bibb had money, but they fought for abolition. Frederick Douglass, we've talked about, and that's a photo in his later years. Sojourner Truth, I had her picture on that bunch of women talking about women's rights. She fought for abolition of slavery. Harriet Tubman fought for abolition of slavery. Harriet Tubman had a lot to do with the Underground Railway, helping slaves escape from the South into the North. Sojourner Truth was a New Yorker, escaped to Canada, and then when New York made a law against slavery, she came back. Her real name, I think I had her real name in the other picture. Where is it? Isabella Baumfree was her real name. I'm sure she took the family name from her owners. She pointed out that when she was a slave, she was required to breed children. And finally, they were taking her children away from her. Finally, she grabbed her most recent child and ran for Canada. There's Am I Not a Woman and a Sister. That was written when she was campaigning for women's rights. That, by the way, caused a split in the women's rights movement. There's the Liberator, that's the masthead of the Liberator, and the other one is the North Star. That's the name of Frederick Douglass's paper. Why the North Star? Anybody in here know? What's the thing about the North Star? You know where the North Star is in the sky? If you stand in the northern hemisphere and you spot the North Star and follow it, you're headed generally in the northern direction. The North Star is what running slaves followed to go north because they only traveled at night. There's another argument against slavery. A guy named Helper, Hinton Rowan Helper. He was a Southerner, and he said, slavery will ruin us. We need to diversify. He wrote a book dedicated to non-slave holding white people of the South. Slavery will hurt the economic prospects of the South. No one's listening, or not many people. Then there's the other side of the argument. I'll give you just some examples. James Henry Hammond, a senator from North Carolina, one-time governor of North Carolina. He's the guy that voted in the gag rule in the Senate to keep abolitionists from being able to make long speeches. He said the North must not allow abolitionists an asylum from which to hurl their murderous missiles. He also said fanatics can be silenced in but one way: terror, death. That's a U.S. senator saying that? Then there's William Lyons Yancey. Later on, he'll become a senator of the Confederate States of America. We'll study some of these other things, like Wilmot Proviso and popular sovereignty. He authored the Alabama Platform in 1848, would be the state's Democratic Party platform to preserve slavery. He tried later on in his life to get Europe to recognize the Confederate States of America, without success. William Joseph Harper, another U.S. Senator from South Carolina, important representative of pro-slavery thought. Memoir on Slavery, given as a lecture. He said that the slave-holding South had achieved a social balance that allowed for steady economic and technological progress while avoiding the chaos of urban development. He said that Southern slaves were better off than Northern workers. George Fitzhugh. Racial inferiority was his big thing. The Negro is but a grown-up child who needs the economic and social protections of slavery. He wrote a book called Slavery Justified, and later on he wrote a book called Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters. Go figure. Thomas Dew, president of William and Mary University College back then, helped block the movement to end slavery in Virginia in 1831, 1832. 3 votes were needed to block to end slavery in Virginia. Was co-author of the so-called pro-slavery argument. And my favorite of favorites, Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright invented a new disease called Victomania, or the desire to flee from servitude. According to him, that was a mental disorder. He said that slaves should be kept in a submissive state and treated like children with care, kindness, attention, and humanity to prevent and cure them from running away. They also used the Christian scripture, somewhat perverted, as a source of information on dealing with slavery. Okay. We're getting ready to go back to where we know about the Spanish-American War. We don't need to talk about that. You don't have these yet. I'll put them up for you this afternoon. Approach to Civil War. Let's see if we can get up to where we are. These things all overlap. Yeah. According to my theory, there's about 10 or 11 steps to the Civil War. That's what we're going to finish with. We will talk a little bit about the war itself and a little bit about the years after. But this is important. During the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, we realized that when we won this war, we were going to get a lot of territory. That became obvious. One young senator from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot is going to make a proposition that a condition to the acquisition of any territory from Mexico by any treaty had to include the provision that there will be no slavery or involuntary servitude in any part of that territory. And since the Senate are the people that are the ones that ratify treaties, and most states become states by treaty, this was germane to the treaty. But the problem is, 50% of the Senate's pro-slave. This is going to slow down business, and eventually President Polk is going to ask Senator Wilmot, please pull your suggestion off the table so we can get other business done. And he doesn't. But people in the House of Representatives don't. And they keep pushing for this, especially led by guys like former President John Quincy Adams. That's when they come up with the gag rule. Another senator from out in Michigan, he's already served as a member of the President Jackson's cabinet. That's his second Secretary of War, Lewis Cass. He has another idea. Instead of the federal government wasting time talking about slavery, let's let the people that live there make up their minds. And he calls this popular sovereignty. Leave it to the people who will be affected by this question to adjust it upon their own responsibility. He's going to push the idea of popular sovereignty. Let each territory make its own decision. And don't leave it to the federal government. He's going to run for president, too. I told you about the Alabama platform. There it is. It was put forward in 1848 for the election of 1848. Among other things, it says the federal government could not restrict slavery in the territories. The territories could not prohibit slavery until they became states. And Alabama delegates to the Democratic Convention opposed any candidate supporting either the Wilmot Proviso or popular sovereignty. Eventually, all of this stuff is going to come to the Democratic Party convention in Baltimore, and they threw out the Alabama platform by a pretty strong vote. So 1848, Wilmot Proviso against popular sovereignty against Alabama platform. Democrats versus the Whigs versus a new party called the Free Soil Party. Nothing different from the Liberty Party. Zach Taylor, old rough and ready they call him, hero from the Mexican-American War, will run as a Whig. Remember, Polk didn't want him to be a hero. Well, he's a hero anyway. Lewis Cass, Democrat, Secretary of War. Senator from Michigan, Secretary of State, one time later on, supports the doctrine of popular sovereignty. So the Democrats support popular sovereignty. Martin Van Buren is going to run for the Free Soil Party. He's been Governor of New York, Secretary of State, Vice President of the United States, President of the United States. Here's the results. Zach Taylor gets 163 electoral votes. Lewis Cass, 127. Van Buren, none. Zach Taylor wins. Now, he comes into office in 1849. They're still arguing about what to do with all this territory we've won. It looks like it'd become a nasty argument. We'll come to something called the Compromise of 1850. Now that Wilmot Proviso, I count that as the first step to the war, okay? The Compromise of 1850, I count as the second step to the war. How are we going to get Texas from these other territories into the Union without upsetting the balance or causing a civil war. Henry Clay gets together with John C. Calhoun. They disagree on issues, but they don't want a civil war. They get together with Daniel Webster, and they make this big bill, bringing Texas into the Union, bringing New Mexico territory into the Union, bringing California into the Union as a free state. Texas probably be a slave state. But nobody can agree with it. It's such a big bill that there's something in there that, you know, anybody can find something wrong with it because it's so big and so complex. And a younger senator, a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas, he's a railroad man among other things. He comes up with an idea. He said, since we can't get the whole thing to pass, let's break it down into pieces and pass each piece one at a time. Which is not a bad idea. In fact, if the Democrats would do that with some of the laws that they want passed now that they can't get through Congress, if they broke it down into pieces, they could probably get part of what they want. But for them, it seems to be all or nothing. At any rate, they're going to follow Stephen A. Douglas's idea. We'll go back and talk about. Let's talk about Zach Taylor as a president briefly. While he's president, remember I said there was an old meaning for the word filibuster, and it was going into someone else's country, causing enough trouble so the American government would have to intercede and get involved in it. That's what they call the filibuster. We had people that wanted us to grab Cuba, and so they went over to cause trouble in Cuba to try and get the federal government to intercede. Basically, President Taylor said, get out of there or else. He also got a treaty with the British. We were suspicious of the British. We had interests out in the Pacific, including a place called the Sandwich Islands, which the British seemed to have an interest in too. And both of us were quietly looking at the Isthmus of Panama thinking, if we could have a doorway through that to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we could get to the Pacific faster. If we owned it, so nobody else could go through, we'd have an advantage over them. We were suspicious of them, they were suspicious of us. So to settle the issue, we signed a treaty just between Britain and America saying, it was called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850. And basically it said, we won't dig a canal if you won't dig a canal, or if we decide to dig a canal, we'll do it together. A canal or even a railroad, either one. That's the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. It will change around 1901. Domestically, he was a Whig of convenience. He was just a general. He wasn't a politician. He didn't think that you could veto anything. Well, it wasn't supposed to be used very much. He supported the principle of a national bank. He wanted California and New Mexico to come into the Union right away. It's a big constitution. When he died in July of 1850, he'd just barely been president for a year. He got a stomach ailment, and unfortunately for him, asked the doctors to help him out with it. And back then, medicine wasn't very well advanced, and they tried saving him with ipecac, calomel, opium, quinine, and then bleeding him. And I think the grand combination of all that killed him. At any rate, he will be succeeded by his vice president, Millard Fillmore of New York. This guy, as vice president, was working at getting that compromise of 1850, pushing it through the Senate. As president, he wasn't too bad a president. Back when he was in New York State, he founded the University of Buffalo, revised the New York banking system. Once he comes into the presidency, he's going to preside over the Compromise of 1850 debate. Then he'll establish harmony in the presidential cabinet, support that compromise. When he becomes president, we're going to have an uprising in New Mexico. It's the established people of Hispanic origin are being beat up upon by other people. He's going to send troops in there to restore order. He's going to stop filibusters to Cuba. And he's even far-sighted enough, he's going to mount an expedition to go all the way to Japan and try and develop relations with the Japanese. The reason being, it would give us a good platform from which to go do business in China. And all the European countries are already doing business there. He didn't like slavery, and he's another guy that said, but we can't start a fight over it. There's Stephen A. Douglas, who did the Compromise of 1850. And that's as far as we can go today. Well, let me check. Yeah, we're out of time. So we'll carry on. We'll